Okay, in this video lecture, we are starting chapter 12, Introduction to Genetics, and we're going to focus on Gregor Mendel and the work that he did with his pea plants. And so I'm going to talk about traits, well, we don't really call them traits, but genes and heredity and how offspring get their traits or genes from their parents, and then go through a lot of vocab here. So this is Gregor Mendel. He's considered the father of genetics. And the reason for that is because he was able to describe how traits, characteristics were passed from one generation to the next. Now, the early beliefs before Gregor Mendel came along was that people thought that offsprings were mixtures or blends of their parents, like mixed-in paints. A red flower crossed with a white flower should end up with a pink flower, but that wasn't the case. In some species it was, and others it was not. And so the study of how things are inherited is called genetics, the study of heredity. So Gregor Mendel, Austrian monk, studied pea plants. And the reason for that was, Gregor Mendel actually wanted to be a teacher. He dabbled in mathematics, but he couldn't pass his examination test. So then he decided to go into the monkhood, and he was at a monastery, and he decided to do these experiments in his garden because he was just curious about nature in itself. And so pea plants were the perfect organism for a variety of reasons. They were small, easy to grow, they grew quickly, you could control how fertilization takes place, and then at least 7 either-or traits. And so what I mean by either-or traits was that for seed shape, a pea plant is either round or wrinkled. There's no mix in between. Seed color, yellow, green. No mixing of those colors. Flower color, purple, white. Pod shape, smooth, constricted, pod color, and so on and so forth. We have a few either-or traits, like ear placement. Is it free or is it attached? Thumb, is it straight or normal, or is it hitchhikers? An example of a trait that is not either-or would be height. Okay, height is determined by multiple factors, environmental as well as multiple genes. We don't have 2 different sizes for humans for height. We have a very wide variation of that. So pea plants, 7 traits that were either this or that. So pea plants, they usually self-pollinate. The pollen from the anther will fertilize the egg within the same flower. And so Gregor Mendel developed true breeding lines or stalks for a trait. So a trait is a specific characteristic. And for this true breeding stock, that means that the offspring were identical to the parents. Basically, another word for true breeding would be purebred. So Gregor Mendel decided to cross-pollinate his lines of stock. He decided to cross purebred or true breeding purple flower pea plants with true breeding white flowered pea plants by dusting the pollen from one and transferring it to the female part of another. And as a result, the offspring of those cross-pollination experiments were called hybrids. So this is self-pollination. You can see that we both have the female reproductive part in the male, and the pollen will land on the female reproductive part, and it can self-pollinate. Cross-pollination means that you are crossing between 2 different flowers. Now, Gregor Mendel used pea plants because he could control the pollination. Notice that this flower does not have a female reproductive part, so it cannot self-pollinate. This flower over here does not have any male reproductive parts, so it cannot self-pollinate. So he controls the pollination, and so he took a paintbrush and grabbed some pollen and transferred it to the other. All right, so this slide is some vocab. With Gregor Mendel, he did a lot of his experiments over many generations. So there's different types of generations. Your first cross-in is called your parental, your parents, okay? And then your F1 is first filial, Latin for son or daughter, son and daughter. And he noticed, one of his observations was that it was always a characteristic of one of the parents. So this is the first generation. He crossed round with wrinkled. These were both purebred, and all the offspring were round. He's like, what happened to the wrinkled? Yellow with green, crossed them together. All of them are yellow. What happened to green? Purple and white. All of them are purple. What happened to white? And so on and so forth. So that was one of the observations that he noticed. He also made a conclusion that the individual's characteristics are determined by factors. So factors to us today are actually chromosomes, okay, genes. We didn't know anything about chromosomes and how we inherit chromosomes, 1/2 from mom and 1/2 from dad. So he came up with the term called factors, and what he was really describing was genes, and how genes are passed from one generation to the next, and you can have different forms of a gene called alleles. So don't get these two terms mixed up. Genes is like the trait that you might be looking at, right? So if in this diagram right here, I'm looking at flower color, purple flower or white, but the alleles are different forms. And we tend to use letters for that, capital letters versus lowercase letters. So here's my purebred or my true breed in purple crossed with true breed in white or purebred white, and I end up with something called the hybrid, which we'll get to. But you get one factor from mom and one factor from dad, okay? So characteristics such as seed color are determined by genes. Yellow and green seed colors are determined by those letters called alleles, and the allele for yellow seeds is blank to the allele for green. So let's just go back here. Yellow crossed with green, yellow shows up, and it's always one and not the other. We haven't talked about this, but that's dominant. So the principle of dominance is that some alleles are dominant over others, which means that if they both are present, the dominant allele, that trait will be expressed. So if an organism has both tall factors, maybe, or both purple factors, like in this diagram right here, big W, it's going to represent the dominant trait, in this case purple or maybe tall. An organism with a dominant and a recessive, so a hybrid, a mix, big W, little w, will be purple, or in this case, tall. An organism with both recessive factors is short, okay? So, yeah. So what happened to the recessive traits? Why, did they disappear? Were they still present? So Gregor Mendel took his experiment one step further. He did an F1 cross. So remember, he took true breeding plants as the parental, purebred green crossed with purebred yellow. In the F1, they were all green. So he decided to do one more cross, self-pollinate. Okay, what's going to happen? Well, he noticed that recessive trait reappeared. The one that disappeared in the first generation reappeared in the second. And it was always in a 3-to-1 ratio, or 25% of the time. So what's going on here? Here's another example looking at flower color. Purple flower crossed with white flower, both purebred. F1 generation, all hybrids, purple. Then he took it one step further, and he allowed them to self-pollinate or self-fertilize. And then at F2, white reappeared, always in 25% of the offspring. So how do you explain the F1 cross? It's through segregation. It doesn't matter. Basically, what happens is that your alleles separate when gametes are formed, and gametes are sex cells, so sperm cells or egg cells. So for example, my husband, he has a widow's peak, okay? I don't have a widow's peak, but my 2 kids have a widow's peak. So widow's peak is dominant over no widow's peak. So if I don't have widow's peak, my alleles, I'm going to use W, are 2 little W's, okay? My husband for sure has a widow's peak, so he's a big W, okay? And then I don't know if he's purebred or hybrid. But my kids, okay, they have widow's peak. Now your factors, your alleles, you get one letter from mom and one letter from dad. One allele from mom, one letter from dad. Well, I can only give a little W. But both my kids have widow's peak. So they inherited a big W. So both my daughter and my son are hybrids for widow's peak. And this is all because of gametes. All of my egg cells have little w, no widow's peak. They carry that allele. My husband, I don't know if he's purebred or a hybrid, but in the case of his gametes, the ones that developed into our kids, they carried the big W for widow's peak. So in this diagram here, they're trying to show you that gametes, during gamete formation, the alleles separate. So this is a big G, this is a little g. This is a big G, this is a little g. And then when the gametes fuse in the process of fertilization to produce your offspring, big G crossed with big G is 2 big G's. Okay, that's a really bad G. Big G crossed with a little g, big G, little g. This is going to be, big G, little g. And then this last one here, 2 little g's. And the only way to show that recessive trait is with 2 little letters. So you can see 3 of them, because each individual here has the capital letter, the dominant allele, big G, they will be green. And yellow does not have that, doesn't have a big G. It's both lowercase g, so they will be yellow. So that does it for 12.1.